Welcome back to Auto Technic. We're back on our 355 project, and well, today's video is going to be very satisfying because we're going to have a lot of visual progress. Last video was very detail oriented. I walked you guys through installing the timing belt, setting the tension, and the camshaft timing. It was a lot to cover. Now today's video is going to be a bit of a different pace because we have a lot of assembly to do to the engine. However, I still have plenty of tips and tricks to show you along the way. So let's start getting this thing put back together so we can get it back into the car. So here's where we stand with our F355. Now, as you recall, we ended up pulling the cylinder heads off mid-timing belt service because we discovered some bad exhaust valve guides. We sent the heads off to our machine shop and got those new guides put in. Now, in the last two videos, I walked you guys through the procedure to get the heads reinstalled. And in my most recent video, I covered installing the timing belts, more importantly, tensioning the timing belts, and ran you guys through the process on how to check and adjust your camshaft timing. Did my best to explain the funky pulley and offset holes and dowel pin setup that are on Ferrari cam gears. So where our timing belts are now is they're essentially done. So we would really be in good shape if we were only just doing a timing belt service and didn't have the heads off. We would be able to just the minimal reassembly, get the engine back together in the car. However, since we had the heads off, we have a lot more off of the engine. So you can see we have all of our exhausts that we need to get reinstalled back on. And frankly, you can see everything laid out here on the table. We need to get that all back onto the engine today. So these parts are cleaned up, fresh O-rings on them, everything's replaced. Engine is ready to go, and the goal is to get this engine fully assembled, buttoned back up, and ready to get back where it belongs, inside the back of this gorgeous F355. Alright, so I think I'm gonna just jump right in and get started on the exhaust, but before we get the exhaust back on, we need to get our oil drain tubes back on. So they have fresh O-rings, and you can see that I have a light coat of that 3-bond sealant on them again. And that's really, like I've mentioned several times in these videos, it's pretty traditional that we use that sealant on top of O-rings on these engines. It helps seal it so there's no leaks. That's really the main thing, right? That seems pretty obvious, but one of the other things is it really helps these slide in. So if you see on the head, I have to slide these into a cup on the bottom of the head, but this O-ring on the top is embedded in a groove on the top surface, so that has to basically slide down on the head as well. So this silicone really just aids in the reassembly of this also, so that way I don't tear or dislodge an O-ring. And see if we can't slide those in, like so. So you can see they took a little bit of force to pop in there. Get that lined up. So, and our third one right here. And you can feel it slide down where it wants to sit right there. So now that those are in, I'll take the hardware and get them bolted in. And we'll come back and torque them. And these are a small, what is this, 4mm Allen. I think this is a 5mm bolt, so not a lot of torque there. We'll just get these snugged, grab our torque wrench and torque them, and then I'll come back and clean off any of the excess sealant that I have oozing out anywhere, because I don't like to leave any traces that I was here. And I got my torque wrench sent 50 inch-pounds. I get these torqued, which is not very much at all. It's real easy to over torque these smaller fasteners. And they have a spring washer on them, so I don't have to worry too much about them coming loose. One thing that I will say is Ferrari likes to use a lot of this Allen hardware, and especially on the smaller sizes, to be very cautious with it. Make sure you're using a good Allen bit, because if you're not, a lot of times it can actually round the hardware. I don't know what they make their hardware out of, but it likes to strip out on the inside. So if you have a really worn bit in there and it's really tight, you could get yourself in a lot of trouble and end up stripping it out. So make sure you use good fresh tooling so that way that's not an issue for you. Get off any sealant that we have sticking out. All right, with the oil drains on, it's time for our fresh exhaust gaskets. Now these are just a single layer of stamped steel with a embossed or raised section on it that goes around the perimeter that's going to crush and seal. I like to have that raised section facing the exhaust manifold and the majority of the flat side of this gasket facing the cylinder head. So I put them all on the same orientation. Pretty basic, and hopefully they'll stay in place while we get the exhaust manifold on. I'm going to slide down just a little. All right, let's go get our exhaust manifold. So we got our exhaust manifold here, or header, with our catalytic converter, and you can see that I left the catalytic converter on when I took it out. That was the first time I've tried doing that. It worked out pretty good. Had to remove the heat shields and O2 sensors and EGT sensor, but I was able to get it out, and my thought is it's going to make it a little bit easier on reassembly and minimize the amount of time I'm going to spend adjusting the exhaust. This connection right here is pretty important on the exhaust adjustment because it basically sits where the catalytic converter sits. This junction right here bolts directly up to the muffler, and our tailpipes or exhaust tips are welded directly to the muffler itself. So essentially this adjustment right here is going to have a big effect on where the exhaust tips sit in the bumper. And I wanted to minimize the amount of time because I'm real picky and they need to stick out the same distance and be centered side to side. And I figured that since this car is pretty good from the start with, not messing with it, it's going to make it quite a bit better. But since we have it out, we can pretty much see the anatomy of it. Now, I think we've covered a lot of this on the previous videos. It's a 4:2:1 header. We have our secondary air rail up here up top. And this right here is our main Y, where we have our catalytic converter bypass. So we have the pipe that sits up top of here on top of the gearbox, where it merges the left and right exhaust in the one, bypasses the catalytic converters. But also, if you look at a picture of a factory muffler on a 355, not only is this upper exhaust path bypassing the catalytic converters and merging the exhaust passes inside the muffler, it's essentially bypassing all of the muffling elements of the muffler and going straight out the exhaust. And that's really why these cars sound so good, even from the factory. They get even better when you put high flow cats on them, aftermarket mufflers, and they really sound great. So one of the unique things about a 355, and it's also one of my favorites. That being said, it is time to carefully guide this in and see if we can't get this onto the cylinder head without knocking any of our gaskets off. So I have to start coming up here at the top, and I have the wire harness unbolted from the top of the subframe and lifted up so I can slide it in between this upper brace and the back of the cylinder head. And once I get the cap back in the area it needs to be, it's pretty easy to get the manifold the rest of the way in. Set it right there and get another grab of it. That. It's tight, and at first I wasn't sure if this was going to work when I pulled them out, but it did. Actually, I need to come up and carry that joint past that stud. There we go. Rotate it right there. Once I get the Y past the head, carefully rotate it, drop it down. We're very close. And home free. That on. We kept all of our gaskets, and we have brand new hardware for the exhaust manifold nuts. All right, I'm gonna get a few of these nuts started on here so that way this stays in place, and then I'll probably drop you guys on in and show you what kind of room we're working with on getting these fully tightened and reinstalled, because space isn't great. All right, so I have the manifold on and I have all the nuts hand tight. Now, really, this wouldn't be too bad to get installed if it wasn't for this secondary air rail right here. This blocks all of our access to get to the nuts and visibility. For the bottom nuts, I can actually reach up underneath the manifold and get to all of them, and it's pretty easy to get to them and tighten them. And I use a long extension with just a wobble, and they're all 13 millimeter. And I can slide this up from the bottom, get to them and get them tightened. It's not too bad. However, it's a completely different story up here on the top, because you can see with our air injection rail, we have not much access at all. You can see down there where all of our nuts are, and this front one's actually not too bad to get to, but their back three are pretty tight. Now, how I go about this is I can take my light right here, get it just right, and if I look in between the cylinder head and air rail, I get good visibility on all my nuts. So trying to get this in here so I can show you guys. Competing for space with the light and the camera. There you go. So you can see right there, you can see the nuts. So one would think that if we can see the nuts through that nice gap right here, that we can take a 13 millimeter wrench, get in there and get onto the nut, which you can, but you don't have a lot of range of motion. You can see I have no range of motion actually on this one. That's all the range of motion I have. I'll get another bite and flip the wrench. So you can do that, and that helps to bring them tight. However, as you tighten this down, this gap from the air rail to the head is going to get too tight to actually get your wrench in there. And, well, that's not a viable option. My main go-to is a 1/4 inch drive ratchet. I have a 13 millimeter on there with a 1 inch wobble socket. This is a long handle ratchet, so I can get pretty good torque and leverage. And this works out the best for me because that wobble gives me just enough clearance to get the head away from the exhaust pipe right there, and I can get onto that nut. So we'll go to the second one and I'll show you here. I get it on, but you can see that now my head is getting wedged up onto the manifold. However, that extension gives me just enough room to get the ratchet clear of my air rail, and I can adjust it right here if I need to on the ones that are further back. So this is my go-to to get these installed. You can see back here that it's actually tighter on that third one. I actually end up taking the extension off and just using the socket and keeping the ratchet down there. And we have a little bit more space back here on the fourth one to get that on and get those tightened. So it's real tight. All the nuts are 13 millimeters. I mean, there's a lot of different tools that you could use to get in there to get to them. One of my favorite tools that if you guys don't have is this kit from Matco. And it is a S-bit 31. And this is all 1/4 inch drive. And it comes with these incredibly shallow sockets right here that also fit into this ratcheting wrench. So get this configured here for you guys. So you can see that that's incredibly shallow, and this works great. And this actual kit is not very expensive. I don't think it's going to work very well for what we're doing here at the manifolds because there's not enough of an angle to get this away from an air injection rail. But since we're talking about tools and tight areas and limited clearance, if I remember correctly, this kit was around $100, and it's quite the buy with all these little different Allens and Phillips bits that are in there. This has saved me so many times. So, not great for this application, but worth talking about. This ratchet right here is really my go-to. Now, unfortunately, because of access and space, there's no realistic way that I see I can get a torque wrench in here and get these torqued. I probably could hit them on the bottom row, but the top row, we're just going to have to rely on the 1/4 inch ratchet and the good old feel method. We'll feel that gasket compress and crush as we get everything tightened down. And fortunately, this is a 1/4 inch ratchet, although it's a long handle, so I'm pretty sure I'm not going to over torque them. And since it is a long handle, it does give me enough leverage to get them plenty tight. It's worked well for me in the past, haven't had any issues yet. I'm going to set you guys down. I'm going to try to get some cameras set up so that way you guys get a good vantage point of me getting all these nuts tight. So with all the hardware hand tight, I like to actually tighten the bottom row first because it's easier. I have more access with this long extension and ratchet, and I can get them tight and suck the manifold to the head. Then it gives me less of a fight to fuss with the hardware on top because I can run them in by hand further before I have to go in there with the tooling and really wrestle with them. So with these, as we mentioned, it's not too bad to get my other hand up in there and guide on the socket. We're fighting the frame rail a little bit, but get that on there and just snug them in. Now I'm not going full tight because I would like to tighten the top ones and then come back and really tighten the bottom row. But we're just bringing them up and nice and snug to get that manifold seated onto the head and that gasket compressed some. And I'm looking again through this gap of the air rail down, and I can see my socket and the nuts also. So you can see the bottom row is really not too bad. It's the top row that's really terrible. You can also see that I can actually cheat up here and get this one as well. So that only leaves us 3 that are tight to get to. So we'll drop to a 1/4 inch and get it on that hardware. Move on. So mentioned earlier, it's easier to take that extension off on this one back here. And the problem is I have to work around this air rail. I can't bring the ratchet all the way up. I'm just kind of working in this dead space right down here. So, and it was worth a shot. I tried getting to the back one without our extension, but it wasn't going to happen. So we'll put our extension back on. All right, so you can see it's not ideal, but it is manageable. I think it's one of those jobs where having a good selection of low profile tooling or a variety of tooling is really going to help you out. Could have been engineered a little bit differently, but that's all right. You saw that it only took me a couple minutes to get it back on. It wasn't too bad. It's time to address our oil drains and manifold on the other side. And also, we need to take care of all the heat shields, O2 sensors, and exhaust gas temp sensors on this. So I'm just going to focus on getting that work done. I think I've talked you through everything I need to here. Get it knocked out and bring you right back. All right, access is tight and space is limited. But you can see with just a little bit of work, we got both of those manifolds back in place, tightened down. I have all my O2 sensors back on, my EGTs. I did leave these guys loose so that way I can position them once they're in the car, and I just got the harness coiled up so it's out of the way here. But we set our exhaust bypass back in place, so it's pretty much going to be right where it is until the engine goes back into the car. Same thing over here, this manifold is on. All of our heat shields are in, and I also reattached our harnesses up here because I had to loosen these harnesses and get them up over this bar in order to get the cats squeeze right through that little gap. So that's all back together. Now with that done, it's time to turn our attention up here into the valley of the engine. All right, so we're going to work on getting our coolant manifolds on. Again, new gaskets, and you can see a very light layer of that 3-bond that I put on. Now I will put this on both sides, but I find it easier to just get it on one side of the gasket and then actually apply it to the other side of the coolant pipe or manifold. And I just find that it's a little bit less messy going about it that way. So our new gaskets are on, and we'll grab our manifold. Now these are symmetrical side to side, so it doesn't matter which one goes where. And I've already prepped these and cleaned all the old gasket off the bottom of them. I actually ended up putting them in my sonic cleaner and really hopeful that I could clean them up a little bit better. These pipes are hard anodized, that's why they're a much darker color. But unfortunately, a couple of the staining and spots was pretty stubborn and didn't want to come off. So it's as good as they are gonna get. So we're just gonna set that on, and I'm gonna loosely set all of my hardware on right now, but we're not gonna tighten this all the way down. We're gonna need to jump over and get our other manifold on and started before we really go start getting these cinched down. So we get our washers in place. So these are an M5 bolt, and it's a 7mm head for the nut. It's a little bit of an oddball size. It's the same way for the main junction on the coolant pipe up here. That's actually an M8 bolt with a 10mm size nut. So again, same thing on the throttle bodies. Not sure why they did that, but it is pretty typical on the V8s and V12s that they have that size hardware there. But I would say it's probably not totally typical to have it across the entire car. So they're on, they're started. I'll back these guys off a little. It's actually a little tight. So you can see I want that side movement there with it. So we're carefully going to move this harness out of the way. And come over here to bank 1. Get our tape off. And I'm just using acetone here. Just giving it one last wipe down to be sure that there's no assembly lube or grease or oil on it. And it's the same thing over here. And much like with a lot of other gaskets I've been talking about on this car, from the factory, these gaskets are sealed up with the silicone as well. Must just be a Ferrari thing, because I can tell you with all my years at BMW that was not a typical thing. But with Ferrari, whether they come from the factory that way or from the workshops, it's pretty standard, pretty typical. Which I'm not opposed to it, but the key is don't put a ton on so it's not oozing out everywhere. And once again, just barely starting the hardware. We want this pipe to be loose. Actually, we're going to want our wire harness up here out of the way, and we will grab our gaskets for the crossover connecting pipe. And again, just a little bit on the bottom. Doesn't take much. All right, so we got the sealant on the bottom of this pipe, and we're just gonna slide this in. I had to kind of dip it down underneath the oil filter housing and over their studs. And the same with the side pipes. We're going to set our hardware on and snug it down. And the reason why we did it on this order is if I were to fully tighten down either one of those side pipes, the alignment makes it really difficult to actually get the center pipe on. Actually, if we jump back to when I took it off, I took off the center bolts and I tried to pull the pipe off and I couldn't get it off, and I actually had to loosen the side pipes in order to get it apart, and this stayed with one of them. So the tolerance is really tight, and if you were to tighten that one manifold or pipe on the side all the way down, chances are very low that you're going to get that centerpiece all the way on. Put a little bit of snugness here on these guys, and then I'm going to jump back to our manifold pipes over here and tighten them down. And we're going to torque these guys to 6 Newton meters right here. All right, so I torqued these M8s up here to 20 Newton meters. And now that everything's tight, I'm just going to come back and do one more pass on these guys just because it's such a light torque. I want to be sure that nothing shifted or moved and that everything is adequately tightened down. I think since we're here, we're going to put a rubber coolant boot on for the cooler back to this pipe. And I've showed this trick before on the channel. I don't like to use any kind of silicones or any soap to help slide a rubber hose on. I use glass cleaner, and that's because it's pretty much alcohol, and once it dries and evaporates, it essentially will leave no residue at all, to whereas a silicone or a soap will leave a residue and potentially cause that hose to not be as secure as one would want. Take that hose clamp off. We'll just leave those loose for now until I get the other side on at the water pump. But now it holds it up out of the way in the valley, so I'm not really working around it. I might want to move this clamp to the other side. There's more space over here. Swap this guy to match. All right, I'll leave those guys loose for now. So, with those out of the way, I think we're going to move to the throttle bodies and get those on, because that's going to allow me to get this harness secured and have it so it's no longer in our way. So we'll pull off our tape. We'll take one last visual down in the ports. Make sure everything is good. So, everything else, we have new gaskets, although, unlike the rest of the gaskets on this car that we've done so far, we're going to install these dry with no silicone and sealant. And just get these set in place. And then I'll go grab our throttle bodies. Alright, so we're going to install our throttle bodies as one. They are 2 individual sets, but they slide into this adjustment screw here, and it's a lot easier to put them on as one solid piece versus two. And make sure our linkage is here towards the center. Now there's also a vacuum hose that was connecting the two, and you can see I have a run of vacuum hose up here at the front. On the other throttle bodies for bank 2, the vacuum hose, one of them had been replaced. It was like a silicone, and it fit very loose onto the nipple, and I just didn't like it. So I'm going to go through and replace all the vacuum hoses here on the throttle bodies while we're doing this work, so that way we can ensure that we don't have any vacuum leaks and everything is the way that it needs to be once it's all back together. So with those in place, it's time to grab our hardware and get them tightened down. Well, good morning. Last night I just ended up getting in a rhythm and I was cruising as we were working on that ITB install, and I ended up going a little bit further than planned. And essentially what we have now is, for the most part, the valley of the engine is assembled and sorted out. So I finalized the install of the ITBs, which then allows me to route my wire harness to the ITBs and get that routed. Since we had our coolant manifolds in, we loose fit this rubber boot on the backside to the gearbox oil cooler. Well, I ended up putting on the front boot and the entire water pump assembly. Now this water pump assembly has like a water pump manifold right here that it itself is bolted to the block. You can see right here is our water pump insert that actually installs into this manifold, so we can pull the water pump out separately of that, and we have our power steering pump mounted to that as well. Now this entire assembly is installed here with just like 4 small Allens and 1 O-ring that seals it up to the block. And once I had that in, I was able to finalize all my clamps up here for this oil cooler. I was able to run my power steering line right here. You can see it kind of curls under the oil cooler, back around, comes up to the power steering pump up there. And it's items like this where I always stress it's really good and helpful to take pictures when you're taking the car apart, because if you're questioning how this is routed and if this went under or over the brackets, you can reference back to those pictures, especially if the car has never been apart before, and you can get it back into the factory location. So with everything in the valley all buttoned up, I was able to get the linkage installed and operational for all of our throttles. So we're pretty much done right up here in the valley, with the exception of vent lines up here on the oil breather, but those connect up to the plenum, so those are going to have to wait. So with the valley of the engine all buttoned up, I think it's now time to move over to our valve covers, specifically our valve cover gaskets. I'm going to show you how I get these installed and prevent the gaskets from pushing out and causing leaks down the road. All right, before we go to the bench and start talking about the valve covers and the gaskets themselves, we're here back at the engine, and I wanted to highlight a couple of the problem areas that we're going to be doing things to combat. The main one is back here on the edge where our valve cover gasket was pushed out before we pulled this apart. I've mentioned before, that's very common. A lot of the cars of this era suffer that problem. I'm going to show you guys how we prevent that. Also, the junctions where our O-rings on our cam plates sit into the head. Now, it's not so prevalent on these front cam seal plates, but on our back plates back there, when you pull them apart, you're going to find that that O-ring is absolutely damaged and destroyed. So, those are our trouble areas. And we'll come back over here to our valve cover. And right back here, you can see is where this is the cam seal plate. This one has a fresh O-ring. Sits right in there like so. Obviously, this is right 50-50 on the cylinder head. You can see how tight that is, where it doesn't even want to sit all the way down. This is going to close that gap up when I fully tighten down this valve cover gasket. It's catching right on the edge, right there. So the problem here is that sharp 90-degree edge on the valve cover and the cylinder head. And once we have those two sharp 90-degree edges right there, they both just bite in. And that's what creates that very large gouge that we had on this O-ring. And obviously, if you have a big gouge right there, that's definitely going to be a source of oil leaks. So to prevent that, take you over to this valve cover. I've already modified it, but if you look real carefully, I've taken a small square file and I just knocked that 90-degree edge off right there. You can see it just barely. So I'm just barely taking that 90-degree edge off with a small square file and just rounding it. Now I do this on all four junctions, and I also do matching ones back here on the cylinder head. It's back down there, so I get them down there and also up here. Now I had the benefit of having the heads off, so I already did those before I put them back on, knowing that space is tight. It is tight to get those filed when the heads are installed, but it is very much so doable. Usually is what you can do is if you have a small square file like this, if you take the handle off or end up cutting it down to be a lot shorter, you have all that you need to get in there and work that, so that way you can get that done and it's nice and rounded. Now, we talked about the front cam seal plates, and you can see right up here where this slides on, it's the same thing. Again, just took a very small amount off. So soften that corner. You can see it almost matches the factory bevel up here. Did that. And the same thing, which I did mention on the reassembly video, that I beveled the cylinder head as well, and that really helps slide these plates in. But the main goal is not to pinch this O-ring and cause that tear, which is going to be a leak path right at the critical mating surface. So before you reassemble it, take your time, bevel all your edges where there's an O-ring on both the cylinder head and the valve cover. Now let's turn our attention to the valve cover gaskets. I have both my gaskets laid out up here, and the one on the bottom is still, I left it intact as one piece, and this is how they will come shipped to you. Sometimes they may be broken right there from shipping, but that's not a big deal, because as you can see on this upper gasket, this is all that I'm going to use. All of this stuff is actually the scrap that I pulled off of it that I won't be using, and I will use this as an example to show you that these gaskets are a bit brittle, because if you fold them over, you can see that it just gave and broke. So do be careful with these gaskets when you're arranging them, because you don't want to damage one in a critical area when you're breaking them apart. So with that being said, you can now see that we have our two main rails and our centerpieces. Now I will say that I haven't had too much trouble with these moving on me, and they kind of just get wedged in there. And they're high enough up on the valve cover that they have not been a big problem for me for leak paths. So I pretty much just leave those as is and don't worry about them. But the big problem is on our valve cover gasket. You can see right there we have our last mounting bolt and about 2 inches to the edge of this gasket. So if we're only relying on clamping force of this valve cover to the cylinder head, and this is our last point of clamping force, and with nothing being attached on this run to the other side of the valve cover gasket, you can see how this would just want to slide right on out from in between the head and valve cover. And again, that's going to be another source of an oil leak. And it's even worse if you end up pinching these O-rings, because it's usually right back on these junctions where that O-ring mates. That's right there. So if you have both of them with a pushed out gasket and a pinched O-ring like I had, absolutely you're going to have oil dripping off the back of your cylinder head onto your exhaust manifolds. So to combat these from sliding out, there's a couple different things we do. One of them is the sealant that we use when I install the valve cover gaskets. Now, pretty much everything that I've used on this car, I've used this 3-bond 1211. Now, this sealant I do like because it's very viscous, it squeezes out easy, it's easy to clean up, meaning if the next guy goes to do this work, it's really easy to get all that residual off, all that old sealant off, and get new sealant on. And that is what the factory used. However, this 3-bond 1217H, this is more of like the Honda Bond or the Fuji Bond if you're in imports, or like Ford Gray or Permatex Ultra Gray. This is a very sticky, robust, thick sealant. So I will say that I do like this because it's useful on servicing the car, although it's not very adhesive, meaning it doesn't really form an incredibly strong bond onto what you're trying to seal up. So I use both sealants in conjunction because a lot of people may say, hey, if these gaskets are a problem, just use this really good sealant along your gasket and put it back together. Well, unfortunately, these gaskets and valve covers come off frequently for the timing belt service. And if you do that, and I have done it in the past, it makes it an absolute bear to get the valve cover off. You spend so much time scraping the old sealant off, scraping the old gasket off. I mean, it works great to seal it, but the serviceability of it is terrible. And having to go through and scrape stuff off, I just basically figured that's not worth it. We're going to stick with the 1211 across the rails of our paper gasket. So we put a light layer of that on both sides of the paper gasket. However, I do take advantage of this sealant and I apply this in all of my corners where I have junctions to the O-rings and where this gasket ends. Mainly relying on the really great adhesive qualities and properties of that sealant to hold everything in place. And since it's a critical seal area, I'm fine putting it there. It's not the entire gasket. Down the road, future cleanup's not that big of a deal. It's pretty easy for the next guy. But that's not the only thing we rely on. If you notice, on this valve cover, I've already modified it, but you can see that I've taken and put 3 dimples right on the outside edge of all 4 rails. So I do so with an automatic center punch. I get my center point marked out, get them evenly spaced, and I'll make my punch, and I'll punch each hole 3 times. Now I prefer to use the automatic punch as opposed to a normal punch and hammer because this is consistent. I'm going to end up with 3. Actually, I'm going to end up with all my holes being the same depth and consistency rather than me just trying to hit it with a hammer and hope for the best. So what we're achieving with this is obviously we're creating a low area where we center punch the hole. But that low area displaces all that metal around it on the outside, which creates high spots. So you can actually hear it when I run my finger across it. Now we have 3 high spots, so they act as like knurls that stick up from the surface, and they're a little bit proud. Now I'm going to take this center punch. We're going to do the same thing on the rails of the cylinder heads and make 3 punches there as well on all 4 locations. And when you have those center marks punched with these rations on the cam cover and the head, in combination with using this in the corners, this sealant, I've had outstanding success with the valve cover staying sealed up. So generally at the dealership, we were doing timing belts roughly every 3 years. Obviously you have people that like to stretch that out longer, 5 years, 7 years. I can say that doing this method, it's going to hold up. Say if someone wants to go to a 5 or 7 year interval on their belt service, this is going to hold up, still seal up. They're not going to have any leaks in between that interval. But we get the added benefit of when the next guy, hopefully it's me, goes to do that timing belt service, the cleanup isn't that bad. So it's a little bit of a compromise, right? We could just go hog wild with this sealant and seal this up really well, but it's a nightmare for the next guy. So we can be a little bit methodical with our approach, our sealants, our locations, and our modifications. And it's going to be the best of both worlds. I'm going to prevent leaks, and it's going to last as long as it needs to. Now, I will say, since I am doing an irreversible modification on the car, I do run this through the client before I go ahead and do it. I explain to them what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and make sure they're okay with that. Because if some clients just would prefer not to have me make these modifications to the heads and file off the valve cover, I'm not going to do it, even though there's tremendous benefit. But if I'm going to be making an irreversible modification to the customer's car, he is absolutely going to be made aware of it, and he'll get the final say if he wants it done or not. Obviously, this customer said, yes, please do it. So I took care of it. It's all part of what I do during the service. So with that being said, I need to finish up getting the other valve cover modified. I need to get all of my holes or dimples on the heads punched. And then I'll bring you guys back and show you the process I use to actually get these cam covers on with the gaskets and sealed up. Because there's still a few more techniques to ensure a great seal. So I was able to modify the other valve cover, and I also got the heads punched with all my dots. Now you may have saw that I set the valve covers on the head, and that allowed me to take a fine point Sharpie and mark where the edge of the valve cover sat on the head, so that way I could find the actual center point of where I needed to put my dimples and get those marked in. Now that that's done, we're going to go through and do one more pass, make sure that these rails are clean. We'll get that Sharpie mark off and make sure that there's no assembly lube left on here, no grease, no oil, and that we're ready to receive the new gaskets. Just come through. All right, let's grab the gasket and talk about those. So here we are with the whole one-piece gasket, as I spoke about earlier. And the way I fit these that go on the engine is I actually just tear them right in the center of those strips. So now I have it broken down to my middle pieces and my long rails. With that, we'll set my pieces over here. And we have the upper rail right now. So these gaskets are specific side to side, but you can see it sits pretty easily back here on this back edge and doesn't really want to move. So I actually just hold that in place, and I can use my finger to push that edge right over, and that piece comes off. Now, if this protrudes in this area a little bit, that's okay, but we just need to make sure that nothing's going to break off and be in there. So a pretty clean, easy break. Now, for the front, this has a dowel pin, and when you push it in place, you can kind of see that it bent my gasket up. And I actually just use a pocket screwdriver, push down in that corner, and break the piece off. I'll do this bottom one down here, the same thing, because I think you guys will have a little bit better of a view. So we'll slide our gasket in place. And you can see right here how it's starting to bend that up. So we'll get it down on our studs. You can see that it bent it, and it pretty much just breaks it for me. just like so. Now, back here, same thing. I just hold the gasket, use that edge, and break the edge of the gasket off. So it's actually pretty simple to get these fit in there. It's really not too bad. Do the exact same thing with these little side pieces. Just set them in there and break them. And this is the one that sometimes might need more fitting, but we just push it in place and it breaks them both off. So as I was saying on this one, I want to make sure that it's not buckled up in there. It's okay if it's pressing in to the O-ring, which is good. We want that, but we don't want this paper being buckled. This back one back here, it's going to kind of float there. We'll have to put our rear plug in to see how that's going to fit, but we should be fine with that. I don't think we need to do any different trimming up there. And you can see right here how this is really the critical junction. We don't want this piece to slide out, but we got to make sure that we seal it up good for the transition from this O-ring to this gasket right there. And we have this junction at 4 points basically on each end of both camshafts, front and back. So let's work to get this valve cover on. We're going to carefully lift our gaskets back off, being sure not to damage them. And we're going to start with our back plug. And I will say that the other 3-bond that I had, that more adhesive stuff that I was talking about that has better adhesion, that tube was bad. I opened it up and it all was cured and solid. So I'm jumping back to a different tube that I have for backup for this, and this is actually Fuji Bond. So this is a Subaru product, same thing as Honda Bond, like I mentioned, same thing as Ford Gray really. Subaru uses this to seal up the 2 halves of their engines. They don't actually use a gasket at all, and this stuff is actually quite nice. I like it quite a bit. So since we don't have a good applicator, I'm going to just use my pocket screwdriver and a little bit right in our corner for where our O-ring and the junction is going to be to the head. We go back to our other 3-bond and we're just going to do a real light coat on the O-ring halfway around. And not very much, just real small amount. So you can see not a lot on there. And set our plug in place. We should have a little squeeze out, which is good. We don't want an excessive amount. So we're dialed. Now, we're going to jump back to our Fuji Bond, and we're going to apply it in all the corners where the O-rings are. We have our cam sensor back here on the intake cam, so there's no O-ring. There's another gasket on the back side. So there's only 3 sets of O-rings that we're going to seal up. And I'm going to apply just a little bit of this, if I can, right in the corner of the O-ring to the head. And I'm doing this now so that way once we set the paper gasket in, this will be underneath the paper gasket. This would have been a lot easier with the other stuff in the tube to get this applied. But I don't want to stop all progress today waiting on another tube of silicone that I'm only going to use in a few spots. So we got that Subaru 3-bond right around all the O-rings. I'm going to jump back to our true 3-bond, the 1211, and I'm going to put a light coat on the bottom side of each piece of paper gasket so we can put those onto the head. All right, so you can see that it's, once again, super light coat, not very much at all. Get this guy down here installed. Is what we want to pay attention to down here at the bottom, so that we squeeze out that sealant that we put in there. Make sure we push that gasket up against the O-ring. The same thing over here at the front. And make sure we push out that sealant and keep this pushed up into that O-ring the best we can. And grab the rest of the gaskets. All right, now with the gaskets on, once again, in all the corners where there's an O-ring meeting the paper gasket, we're just going to put a small dab of this 3 bond in there, or this Fuji bond, I'll call it, so we're not confused. And you don't want to put too much in there. You put too much in there, you're actually going to cause more problems for yourself. All right, so our little O-rings here, we'll put these in before we forget. And they're a bit of a tight fit, and the groove isn't very big, so I kind of stretch them out a little bit to make them fit in there a little better. You can see that front one started to slide out just a little bit. Set them in place. So I just kind of put my 2 fingers in them and roll them just enough. They sit where they need to. Needs a little more. There we go. And before we get ahead of ourselves, we're going to do one last check of our cam caps, the 9 Newton meters. Since we had them on and off so many times during the camshaft timing, I always come through one last time. Make sure they're all tight and that we didn't miss any of them. All right, now everything's in place. We're going to take some of that 1211, apply a thin coat to the bottom of the valve cover in preparation of getting it on here. All right, there we are again. You can see the bottom side, including our spark plug flats, that a very thin layer of that silicone. This is one of those cases where less is more. So, we have our 1211 on effectively on both sides of the gasket. We have our Fuji bond in all corners where the O-rings are. And the reason why you don't want to put too much of that Fuji bond in those corners is because when we push in this cam cover onto that gasket, it can actually hydraulic the gasket out. So if you put too much sealant in there, it's actually going to push the gasket out as soon as you start to tighten it down. So that's why we're so sparse with our sealant and doing minimal amounts. Make sure all of our O-rings got front two O-rings here. Started to pop out a little bit. Check, check, check. Slide our valve cover on. We're gonna go get our hardware. All right, so there's one more thing that we're gonna do when we tighten down this gasket, and I have a camera right here set up to show you, and it's when we tighten down this leading edge bolt at all the end of the rails, we're actually gonna hold the gasket in place with a pocket screwdriver. You can see that we have some movement, so I'm gonna push it in as far as I can, and then bring the valve cover down. You can see the sealant was pushing out right there. We're gonna do that. So that's what I was saying. If you put too much sealant in there and you tighten down the corner of that valve cover, that sealant, as it gets pressed out, will actually push your gasket out and already start to push it out and cause that problem. So using our pocket screwdriver, we can get in there and we can hold that gasket in place and ensure that it doesn't move on us as we just snug the valve cover down. So do that in all four corners. Nice and slow. You want to have that sealant ooze out. And this guy down here. We're getting the edges first. And like everything else, we're going to come back through and torque these, and I have this set now at about 8 Newton meters, and make sure all of our fasteners are at the same torque. We go too tight, we could actually split that paper gasket. We will clean up any squeeze out up here in the spark plug tubes. And there you go. There's my method to sealing up the valve cover, the sealants I use and where I use it so I don't have valve covers push out. Now, we did clean up the sealant and the spark plug tubes. I will come back and clean any squeeze out along the outside of the valve cover gasket. Although I'm going to let it wait and cure up a little bit, it gets a little bit tackier and it's a lot easier to clean up. I will grab you guys, drop you in here so you can see real close and see the amount of squeeze out that we're working with. And now we need to shift to the back of the valve cover gasket because we need to get the cam sensor housing on, and there's still more of the seal up back there. We still have a big hole in this section. All right, so you can see right there, we just have a minimum amount of squeeze out, quite manageable. So I essentially apply the sealant onto my gasket or valve cover, and then I use my finger and essentially wipe it all off, but just leave the smallest film left there that I can, and get you guys dropped in here. And you can see just a little bit right there. Now, we need to seal this section here with the cam sensor up, and you can see that I've wiped it off already. And that's because I was checking to see how much of my paper gasket sticks out right there. And it actually sticks out flush, but there's a slight difference in between the cam cover and the head. This side's pretty good. So this, sometimes you'll have this paper gasket sticking out. So once I get this all installed and torqued, I'll come back with a razor blade and I'll slice it off so there's nothing sticking out here. But now we need to shift our attention to getting our cam sensor housing installed on the back of the valve cover. We also need to deal with our spark plugs and our spark plug cover, and then I think at that point we can consider this valve cover finished. Alright, so we will just come back here, wipe up any of that squeeze out off. Our Fuji bond we only install at the junction. Yeah, that's probably more than I need. Move some of that there. Now, we have another paper gasket that goes onto those two studs down there for the cam sensor housing. One thing to note, there's two studs in the cylinder head, and they have dowel pins on them, so we have two holes that are larger that will slide over those dowel pins. But before we do that, go back to our 1211 and do our ghost coat. So you can see not much there. just like the valve cover. On the cam sensor housing, it gets a light coat as well. All right, you can see that we're almost there. Again, made pretty good progress yesterday, but I just ran out of time. It was a little bit short of a day for me, and nearly had the engine completely buttoned up. Honestly, that was my goal, but you can see we fell just short of it. So finished up getting the other cam cover put on. The only difference on this side is we don't have a camshaft sensor. We have a vacuum pump since this is a later model car. This supplies vacuum for our brake booster, so I installed that. There's no cam sensor on this side since it's an ME 5.2. But you can see I went through and got the new spark plugs put on. Our spark plug covers with the new gaskets on. Just took care of some small items like our vent line. Oil tank's back in place. All of our oil lines are installed. And I got the front covers all installed and buttoned up. So really, this thing's super close. Actually, in all reality, this is all we have left. We have to install our plenums, our fuel rails, crank hub or balancer, whichever you prefer to call it, our new belts, and just some ancillary hoses once the plenums are on. So we're really, really close to having this engine fully buttoned up. However, there's one thing I need to circle back to, and that is the sealant here on our cam covers and valve covers. So you can see real good up there where it's squeezing out. There's two trains of thought on this. I know some people prefer to leave that there because they like to leave it as evidence, so to speak, like, you know, proving that they had that part off and it's resealed. And then there's my train of thought where I don't like having that ooze out and that stuff sticking out. So if I take you over to this valve cover, you can see that there's no sealant protruding from the valve cover and gasket anymore. And that's because I go back and I clean it up. And that was one thing I mentioned a little bit earlier. Now, I will say that this is a lot easier if you catch the sealant right when it starts the setup and it's not fully cured. If it's still wet, it just smears and makes a huge mess. If it's fully cured like mine is now, it's a little bit harder to get off, but still pretty easy. If you catch it right in the middle where it's starting to get tacky, it actually makes this job incredibly easy. But all I do to take care of this is just a pocket screwdriver right in that gap, and you can just run it in there. You can see it just basically tears and comes right off. Bear with me, I'm doing this with my left hand here. And right like so. So you can see that just like that, I get that off. So we'll go and just run this all the way down along the perimeter, get everything cleaned up. And really, again, it's just my preference. I don't like the sealant sticking out. I think it looks a lot nicer this way. It looks a little bit more, you know, intentional and polished finished product. There also is another thing that I do, and you may have saw me when I was installing the vacuum pump, but where these paper gaskets stick out, I had to do it for the vacuum pump so this adapter plate sits flush to the block, because on this side those paper gaskets actually stuck out and it was going to interfere with this other gasket that has 3 holes that bolts onto the head. So I used a razor blade and cut those flush. But on our gaskets that seal up these cover plates for your valve covers, they actually stuck out on the back side and up here on the front side. So I come back with a razor blade and I cut that extra paper off that's hanging off too. Again, it just looks tacky in my opinion. It takes just a second, shave that paper off, it looks a lot better. One more thing I want to talk about, and we mentioned it a little bit when we were installing the heads, and that's pressure washing the engine. Now, I'd say in general on a Ferrari, it's not a great idea to pressure wash the engine. The wire harnesses, basically the water intrusion can cause a lot of problems. And normally I'm a big fan of pressure washing engines, keeping them clean, but on Ferraris I would stay away from it. There's 2 other special considerations to think about on a 355. One of those are our head bolts or studs. As you can see, this one is sitting right there in the valley and it's exposed to the outside elements. The other one are spark plug cover tubes here. If you pressure wash this engine, obviously water can get in there and start corroding on your studs, which we talked about on the last video. It can also get behind this cover and get into the spark plug tube area. And I've actually seen where that causes a lot of corrosion on the cylinder head where that water gets in there and can cause a lot of damage where those really fine O-rings go. So for those of you wanting to clean your 355, my recommendation is to not pressure wash it. Your best bet probably is dry ice blasting if you really want to go after it and get it cleaned. Fortunately, this car is exceptionally clean, especially given the mileage, so it's not a big concern, but while we're here, it's something I wanted to mention and talk about. I think we're going to move over to our parts now, and I'm probably going to start with the crank hub and our ancillary belts and get everything buttoned up on the front of the engine. All right, so fortunately our balancer or crank hub is not a press fit, and it will slide on nice and easily. However, our front crank bolt, we will need to get that on and torqued to spec, and this one calls for 197 Newton meters. So we got a little bit of blue Loctite on the bolt, and we'll just run it in by hand. And in order to get this torqued, we're actually going to have to do a little reaching. It's a little bit easier if you have two people, but I don't. I'm here home alone. And you can see back here at the back of the bell housing, right where my screwdriver is at, I have rotated the engine so I have an opening on the pressure plate. So I can work that screwdriver in there, and you can see that pressure plate rocking a little bit. So I'm going to hold that screwdriver in place. I already have my torque wrench set. And this is what we're going to do. We get our front crank bolt torqued to the 197 Newton meters. Like so. So with that, we're going to jump over to our ancillary drive belts. All right, so for ancillary belts, I'm going to start up here with our little guy, and this is our power steering pump belt. And you may have noticed that when I installed the timing belts, I always like the lettering or writing on the belts to be facing me when I'm looking at the engine. Again, it's another one of those little things that does not matter, but it is my preference, just how I like to do it. My OCD getting the best of me. But this little guy, we're going to wrap it on, and it is driven just off the water pump right here to the power steering pump. You can see it's pretty tight. Now, once we get that on, it's pretty simple just to run this bolt out, and that's going to pull our pump outward right here and get this belt tight. And we'll just get it close to start with. All right, so you have the belt on, so now we need to tension it. Now, in the factory workshop manual, there is only a spec for a Stager gauge to tension this belt. And let me go grab that gauge and I'll show you real quick. So here's our Stager gauge, and you can see there's not even close. I can't even get one run on it. If you actually hold these two pads up that are supposed to be on the belt, it would touch both pulleys. It's one of those things. It's comical. They give you a spec to use this gauge, and it is absolutely physically impossible to get this gauge on there. I don't know what they're thinking. However, in a previous video, I talked about that bulletin. I think it's 1016 or something. And that bulletin has a conversion chart, so we can use our digital frequency meter, and we can use that to set our tension. So I just have a little notepad here, so I made it easy for myself for all the belts. And on our power steering, we're looking for 290 to 295 hertz. And we're at 372, so we're too tight. So we'll actually back this off some. Give it a little bit of a rotation. .318, still too tight. .293. Let's give that a spin. 295, 292. So that's set right within our tolerance, but is what I like to do is I'm going to let the belt rest because we just stretched it a little bit. I'm going to let it rest and hang out there for a little bit, and it's going to give it a little bit of stretch. My reading might go down just a hair. I'm going to get the rest of the belts on. I'm going to tension the rest of those belts. Then I'll come back after a couple minutes of resting time, double check my tension, and then we'll lock down our locking nut up here on the power steering pump, and also our lower nut on where we're pivoting, and get that locked in. So with this belt on, we're going to jump down to our AC compressor belt. And again, all the lettering reading out, but you also notice in this belt that we have arrows for the direction of rotation. So that is why I set all of my writing in this direction, because on the belts that actually have arrows that say that they're directional, that orients them all in the same position. So for this guy, we're just going to work it on. And our adjustment is down here. Again, it's another 13 millimeter. And what are we looking at on this? We're looking at 200 to 220 hertz. So we're going to start running this bolt in, which is going to pull our AC compressor down. And we'll take a check. 200 to 220. 137. 151. 164. 183, so we're getting close. 210. All right, we got 210, so that one's dead set in the center of the spec. I'm going to move everything over, and we're going to take care of the alternator belt real quick. Again, we're going to let this rest and stretch. Recheck the tension one more time before we tighten our locking nuts here on the bracket. So we'd adjust, or we would tighten these two nuts. And there's also the nut on the bottom, which I loosened when the engine was still in the car when I was underneath of it. And I'll leave that loose once the engine's back in the car and I have a lot of access to it. I'll torque that one as a final step. So for now, let's shift over to the alternator. So our alternator belt is a little bit different than our power steering and AC belt. Because our alternator is fixed in place, it's not adjustable. We have a tensioner pulley right here, what we adjust to tighten that belt. And it's part of the service. The car gets a new tensioner pulley. But I leave that pulley off as I install the belt because I find that it makes it just a little bit easier. And again, directional. We got our arrows pointing in going to the right direction. So I'll bring the belt over and get it routed in place. And I'm just using my hand to make sure it's in the grooves. Get it all the way into the water pump pulley. Now with that, we're going to install our tensioner. Now this tensioner is, to some may seem counterintuitive because the spacer sticks out more on the back side than the front side. I'll show you guys right there. So we're going to take that and this slide it on right there, and then we can work on tensioning our belt. So we're going to just bring this nut snug but not tight, so that way the tensioner doesn't want to rock. Back it off some. And then we have a 19 on the bottom, which is going to drive our tensioner up into our belt and get it tight. And this one is set to 95 to 105 hertz, measured here on this run. 56, we'll keep climbing. 99, 98. So we're within our range. And we'll rotate the engine. And then, as I mentioned, I'm going to let it sit, let the belts rest, recheck everything, and then get everything tightened and torqued down for good. Well, my memory is foggy and I ended up assembling this alternator tensioner bearing wrong. I'll show you guys real quick. So if you drop down, you can see that my belt is running right on the forward edge of it, and I have a lot of that tensioner left on the back side. What I did wrong is this other large washer right here. This washer needs to be on the back side of this bearing, and the nut and my small washer need to be on the front side. So I am going to pop that off real quick, get those swapped around. You'll see how the belt's going to ride a lot better on that pulley. Retension the belt, and I'll show you guys the final product. All right, got that washer swapped around. It's back on and tensioned, and you can see how I now have a lip. It's still super close, but it's not nearly as bad as it was. So what I had is there's one washer I just had on the front, and that washer actually needs to go back behind the pulley and the bracket. So with that, I think we're going to shift our focus to the top of the engine, finish up with our injectors, our plenums, and all of our hoses, and get this thing fully buttoned back up. All right, it is time to put the plenums back on the engine and show you guys how they mount on. They use these rubber grommets right here on each of the throttle bodies, and that's what the plenum mounts to, and it's also what seals it up. Now, the way that they hold everything together is we use these clamshells, and these slide over this rubber boot just like that. And if you look on the bottom edge of that clamshell, it's actually capturing right here on this bottom lip of the throttle body. If I slide this one on, there's no rubber boot, but you can see that it's positively locking it in place. Well, there's a matching groove on the bottom of the plenum that goes on the top side, just like this throttle body. So these clamps essentially are encapsulating our rubber boot to the throttle body and the plenum. And then we use a nice hose clamp that has a nice little bolt. It's not like a worm drive. It's probably a 5mm bolt. But we'll put those on and tighten that down, and that retains these clamshells, and everything stays in there pretty tight. System works pretty good. It's pretty basic, but it is a little tedious to get assembled. Disassembly is not too bad. Reassembly takes a little bit more work. So I like to go and just get started with my rubber boots here. And I will say that once we set the plenum on, it overhangs back towards me, so we don't have much working room on this side. We're going to be doing most all of our work over here in the valley, but also it kind of wants to tip and fall into the inside. So that's what makes it a little bit more difficult. And also, it's going to be your first instinct to install these clamps like that, because you have so much room on the inside and it's so easy to get them in there and attached. But it's really difficult to get the outside one in if you do it in that manner. So I've found that it's a lot easier to actually bring them in and put your clamps on like that, because you can work both of them in from the inside of the valley and then work the actual hose clamp around them. With that being said, let's grab the plenum and I'll show you how I get it done. So we'll get this guy set up on here. And you can see it just rests in place right now, but as I let go, it's going to just tilt in. So we'll take one of our clamps, and one trick I've learned over the years is glass cleaner. Again, you spray it on the inside of that clamp, and that helps it slide over the rubber hose a lot better versus doing it dry. And get that slid in position. And you can see now that I have just one clamp slid on, that plenum is staying in place pretty good. I'll grab this next one. Up, came loose. And I'm looking over here on the outside to make sure that my clamp is on that rubber boot. There we are. Let's see if we can get this other one on. So that one just snapped in place. We'll even them out. And we'll come over here with our hose clamp. And I have the bolt out of it. Just carefully work it around. And install that bolt. And we don't need to really cinch them down right now. I just need this tight enough to hold my clamps. They really hold everything in place. And there's kind of a ridge where this clamp wants to sit in the center of the two clamshells. You can see it self-centers, holds everything together quite nicely. And like so. And if you recall from our video on the disassembly, we're going to orient them pointing in towards the center of the valley, because when we have the other plenum on, that's going to give us access to tighten them. However, we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to our linkage here on the throttle, so that way we don't have any interference issues. And I leave all of my hose clamps loose until these are fully installed, just in case. And this one we're keeping out and away from our linkage. If you remember, when we pulled this apart, this one was actually hitting our linkage and blocking it. I have had it. If you have these assembled over here, it can actually cause the linkage to get jammed at wide open throttle. So you really want to be careful. And it's usually on the second to the last on the rear ones. So this one's cylinder 3, and it's going to be cylinder 6 on the other side of the engine. So we're good there, and we're free of all of our linkage. Just one more. And I will say this glass cleaner trick on these clamshells makes a world of difference. If you try to do them dry without any glass cleaner, they catch that rubber and you'll be fighting to get them on. And you can see that once I get these lined up, they slide right on with that glass cleaner. And the best part about the glass cleaner is it just evaporates, leaves no residue, and no trace that it was ever there. Works really well for assembling things. All right, so really not too bad. I'm gonna come back and get all my hose clamps tightened, get this one locked down. I'm gonna shift over, get the other plenum put on, get the last of my miscellaneous hoses put on. And once I get all that stuff buttoned up, I'll bring it back, because there is also one more thing that I need to talk about that when you're doing a timing belt service on these cars that you need to address and take care of, which I've already done but haven't shown you. So let's get this stuff knocked out and we'll come back and revisit that. Well, there you have it. It is all buttoned up and back together, ready to drop back into the car. Now, one thing that just real critical that you don't want to forget is this hose right here. You can see that I have it sitting in position, but it's still loose. And you're going to want this hose on because we need to slide this on to the water neck on the back of the firewall. See that guy right there? We're going to have to slide that on as we're installing the engine. If you forget this, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So you can see that essentially our firewall is about right here, so we don't have enough room to slide this hose off that neck. Also, you can see that our water pump pulley is right there. So we don't have enough room to slide it off on this end either, so it's kind of just trapped in there once everything's assembled. So do not forget that guy. Our plenums are fully installed. As we mentioned earlier, really watch out for the bolts on the clamps for that guy right there and the one on the other side for the linkage. You want to make sure that that has full travel and does not get stuck wide open. Super critical, so we're good with that. Another thing worth noting here is this coolant hose here that comes off the back of the water pump. The coolant hose kit that I got did not come with that hose for whatever reason. I have no idea why. It came with the hose that goes to the car, and it came with all the other radiator hoses, but it didn't come with that, and actually it didn't come with the smaller hoses here off of our expansion tank as well. So you can see that I bought a roll of bulk hose there to deal with those smaller ones, and the same thing up here for this hose in the valley of the engine. Just bought a piece of bulk hose. It's a simple straight hose. So added a little bit of expense to our kit, but we got all of the coolant hoses replaced. And everything's cleaned up. I mean, this one was pretty clean to start with. The owner did come over when I had everything out and apart and spent some time wiping it down and cleaning it up for me and for himself. So it's looking really nice. We have our new oil filter on. It is torqued, and yes, that is a normal Ferrari thing to torque your oil filters. All of our wire harness for the engine is set, new spark plugs. Everything's in place and we are good to go. We have our airflow meter connector here and our intake air temp, that's just lingering, and our O2 sensors on either side, and that side looks a lot worse because of the F1 pump, but once it's in the car and get everything positioned, that stuff will button up pretty quick. There is one more thing that we need to talk about that's really important, and it's a step that you need to take care of while you're doing your belt service on a 355. And that item is, if I can get my hand in here, show you, this little check valve right there. So this vacuum hose goes up onto the throttle body for cylinder number 8, and you can see it's a little one-way check valve, and there's a corresponding one over here on bank 1. These two check valves tee into this vacuum hose, and it actually comes up the subframe, comes back here, and feeds into our canister, or our vacuum reservoir, back here in the back corner of the car. Now those valves frequently fail. They'll stick open. Now these guys are critical because they are a one-way check valve, so they are allowing the engine to pull the vacuum reservoir down to a vacuum, so they only should be allowing air to flow into the engine and not allowing the air to flow back into the reservoir. So the purpose of these is when the engine's in a state where there's not much vacuum, your reservoir maintains the vacuum, or when the engine's shut off and it sits overnight, you should be able to maintain the vacuum that's in the reservoir. Those valves frequently fail, stick open, and you will have a leak, and that's going to cause problems with your exhaust bypass valve operation and your secondary air pump. Now on this particular car, my valve on bank 2 was stuck completely open. It was not functioning at all, and the valve on bank 1 was. Now if you have just one valve, since they're teed together, it's still going to cause that reservoir to deplete all the vacuum. So you definitely want to check those valves. They're not very expensive. Just replace them. Every belt service, put the new ones in. Also, while we're going through and getting those valves in, pay attention to your vacuum hoses, because find the one. Oh, here we go. So you can see on this vacuum hose that although it looks like it's in pretty good shape and still flexible, it has a pretty big tear right up here on the end. Although the hose is still pretty flexible and not really degrading that bad, you want to be careful for that, because I saw a couple hoses on this car that actually had those tears and cracks on them. So I went through and I replaced every vacuum hose that's in there. There's a couple vacuum hoses that feed in between the two sets of throttle bodies on either side. There's the one that goes to those check valves that I mentioned right here. And I replaced that vacuum hose all the way back. And there's also the vacuum hoses up at the front for the fuel pressure regulators. So the vacuum hose is cheap. I was there this, you know, the car's 25 plus years old. It's time to just get them taken care of, get new ones in. But definitely look for those little small things. Those one-way valves, you can just put them in your mouth and you can test them. You can push and pull with air and see if they're actually functioning. Again, even if they are functioning, I replace them. They're so cheap. I just want to make sure the customer doesn't have any issues. I take care of it. But pay attention when you're reassembling everything. Look for that little torn vacuum hose. Look for those little worn things that are starting to fail. We address those now, we can ensure that the car is going to be on the road, trouble-free, and the customer can enjoy it for much longer time, which is the ultimate goal. She's all buttoned up and done. I mean, we are ready to get this back in. You can see our harness is set and ready to fish through our little hole. That little access hole right up in there. And we're going to work to get this engine put in. However, I think we're going to take care of that on the next video. Alright guys, I really hope you enjoyed that video. Honestly, I'm having a lot of fun making these videos because although I did this for 10 years in the dealership, worked day in and day out on these cars, I've found that even some of my close friends, even my family, they knew that I was working on these cars. They knew what I did. You know, they hear me talk about it. But being able to finally show you guys exactly what I do, how I do it, and what's involved, it's really been a lot of fun because I realized there's just really a lot there that a lot of people didn't understand what it took to actually service these cars. And obviously I have a big passion for cars. I really like working on cars, especially servicing Ferraris. So I really like working on this car, showing you guys all the tips and tricks and things that I've learned over the years, and really just showing you guys what I love about these cars, why I like working on them. And I hope it's helping you guys at home with your projects. Hopefully it's giving you guys some value, some entertainment value watching the videos. But I'm having a blast. Hope you guys are liking it. Alright guys, you know the drill. I want you to like, share, and subscribe. Also, let's get in the comments section. Let me know what you thought of the video. And at the least, jump in there. Let me know where you're from. I want to know the city, state, or even country where you're viewing the video from. And let's see what kind of reach this video is getting. As always, guys, I appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.